Environmental, social, and governance topics have historically been on the C-suite agenda, but it's really only been in the recent years with the evolution and expansion of ESG scope that is now materially influencing the way companies structure themselves, conduct business, and serve their customers. CDOs are now challenged with how they harness the power of their data assets and analytics to advance their organizations and drive meaningful, sustainable, and measurable growth and value. Join our KPMG global ESG and data analytics leadership as we explore those challenges and opportunities faced by our CDOs.
Now we're good, right? All right, thanks guys. So welcome back after lunch, everybody. Seems kind of a slow start with just 2 sessions before lunch, but we're rolling. We're getting ready to get started. Let me introduce this next section, one of my favorite topics, monetization. If you want to get people to pay attention to this stuff, put a dollar value on it. And that's what our 2 speakers are going to talk about today. Karan Dhawal is enterprise data and transformation leader, and Jason Brown has been working in this space. He'll, I'm sure, tell us a little bit more about his background as well. But these guys have a services company, let me get this right, that helps other companies do this.
That is true.
All right, great. Well, thank you guys. Oh, also, if you're new here, we're using the Wahuva polls during this session. So go ahead and kick on the Wahuva app and get that started so you can participate in the polls. They'll give us some prompts as we're going forward. They want to get your votes in here as well because it's a little bit of feedback, right?
Yes, exactly.
Thank you both.
Great. Right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session. Really appreciate you all joining us here. And I know we have a number of folks online. I have no idea where to look for them, but I trust they are observing us somehow, out there in the interwebs. Thank you for that introduction. So again, I'm Jason Brown. I'm a partner with this company called ZS. ZS is a consulting, operations, and technology company. We were founded in the early 80s, and even from that point until today, the majority of the work we do focuses on what I consider like commercial applications. So if that's things that deal with sales or marketing or customer service, kind of customer touching enterprises. Now my background, so I am going to be kind of the yin to Karan's yang, I guess. So I'm on the business side of the equation. Typically, I work not with chief data officers, but perhaps with chief marketing officers or chief commercial officers. My experience is predominantly in financial services, but ZS as a company, we cover nearly all industries. I will say on the topic of data, I am probably the least qualified person in the room. So of course, I'm the one leading the session. It just makes perfect sense. And then I have to say, I went to MIT to get my executive MBA, and they didn't let us into these buildings. So this was kind of a new experience for me. I think this is for the smart people, and they kept us over by the river just looking at the pretty views. So anyway, I'm excited to be here. I'll let Karan introduce himself as well, and then I'll get us going.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here. This was, again, my dream to be at MIT, so again, was not even allowed here. I went to Louisiana State University, great place. I've been in data space for long enough, and now joined GS, part of their digital and technology practice, bringing AI to life for clients, right? Not just in customer, but everywhere. And that's the intention. We'll talk about data monetization.
All right. All right, so just a little orientation to the session, what we're trying to do, what we hope you're able to take away. I'll spend a little bit of time covering the what at a high level, just to make sure we all know what we're talking about when we say monetized or monetizable data elements. So I'll do that, and then I'll definitely spend some time on the why. So why is this important? Why is the ability to kind of value our data assets important to companies and stakeholders in your firms, your organizations? I'll pass it over to Karan to spend a little bit more on the what. He'll share a bunch of examples of organizations that have monetized their data in one form or other. And then we'll spend a bit of time also on the how. So we have some experience at ZS, some ways to kind of identify and value the truly valuable pieces of your data, and Karan will share a little bit about that. What I will say is we want to try to keep this interactive, so we recognize we have the session after lunch. It is very hot outside. This is not conducive, to just kind of sitting quietly and listening to the two of us drone on. So we will prompt a few questions to you in the app. Many of you may have already filled those in. We saw several answers already. So we'll do that, give you a chance to engage, but don't leave it to that. I think just, shoot up a hand, ask us questions during the presentation if something strikes your interest. We will also leave some time for questions at the end. Okay. So that's our plan. All right. So I'll get us started talking about value in data assets. So as I said, I work predominantly in financial services. I'm quite interested in this topic of valuation. You, I'm sure, have read and seen things like this Economist article that talks about data now being the most valuable asset in the world. I think it was 2017 where they had pegged the moment where data surpassed oil as the world's most valuable asset. So I think there's this general recognition that we're sitting on a lot of value with the data that we have within our organizations. That value is reflected in the company valuations of many of the clients that I work with. So we're to the point now, I think the most recent data that I had was 2020, where 90% of all the valuation in the S&P 500 is in intangible assets rather than physical assets. And an enormous component of intangible assets is, in fact, the data that we have within our organizations. Now, that also includes brands and patents and other things. So I don't want to leave you with the impression that 90% of the valuation is data, but it's an enormous fraction of what matters. And so it kind of begs the question, well, if a lot of the value of these organizations is in their data, how do we actually understand what specifically in the data is valuable? Now, again, from a finance perspective, I would love to do a real asset valuation of this data. I would love to set up intercompany transfers and have transfer pricing and have one department, having to buy data from another in order to really get a market price for the data. That's not really a practical solution. So I think the practical solution is to get a relative value for the data and to look at a couple of things. So to look at the scarcity of the specific data element that we're talking about and to look at its applicability, its use. Data that is both scarce and widely applicable is likely to be very valuable. And so when Karan gets into his section, he'll talk a little bit more around how we identify scarcity, how we identify the breadth of use of data elements, and that will be kind of foundational to some of these valuations. Okay. Just to make sure that we know when we're talking about monetization, so I think if you're like me, where your head initially goes when we talk about monetization is data products that I'm going to use externally. I'm going to make a data product and sell it, or I'm going to use it with my partner to kind of enhance the value that the partnership brings. And that is, for sure, one way to create value through our data assets. And something you should be considering, something we'll share some examples on. But I think the more common application, and I think the larger source of value, is actually the internal use of that data. And we shouldn't ignore that when we're thinking about the value of the data. So whether we're using data to improve the way we create revenue, whether we're using data to reduce the costs that we incur as a business, either in the acquisition of data or in the operation of the business. Whether we're using data to mitigate risks for the business. All of these things create value. And of course, there's an idea of innovation that the data itself might lead to a product either that we use internally or externally. So we'll talk about all those forms of valuation. We'll share examples from an external and an internal perspective. I think my contention is most of the value is typically going to reside on the internal side. And so we do need to make sure that we're accounting for that and we're not kind of discounting the worth of data assets for our internal businesses. Okay. All right, so if we want to value data assets, or if we in fact believe we're sitting on top of a lot of value, I kind of presume from the slide I showed previously that if 90% of all the value is in intangible assets, there's probably a lot lurking in all of our organizations. And I'm sure with where you all sit, you've seen this and realized some of this value. So my first question is, well, how do we go and get it? Okay, and I'll continue the little oil analogy if I can, and say, the way this typically works and what I've seen is we get a team of data scientists, an operational team, and we say, hey, we want to build a new model for our customer service center, or we want to build a new model for prospect acquisition. Again, I work much on the front office side of the world. And so we send the team, they set up their data rig, and they go and they start mining for the data. And then we have another team, and they're working in another department, and we say, hey, yeah, we want to find some way to reduce the costs in our operations. And so we set up another team, and they drop their rig into the ground, and they start mining for the data. And it may very well be that, well, first of all, we don't need 2 rigs mining for the data. Maybe we can do that a little more efficiently. Maybe they're mining in the wrong place. Maybe the valuable assets aren't sitting in that department. Maybe they're sitting in another part of the business. And so if we don't have, at an organizational level, a sense for where the value lies in our data, we're likely to make these types of mistakes. We're likely to go mining in the wrong place. Or we're likely to drop more rigs in than we actually need to drop in. And so that's part of the kind of the crux of the idea here, is how do we surface to the organization the most valuable assets? How do we do it in a way where not just the data scientists or the CDOs understand it, but where the business stakeholders understand it, where my chief marketing officer knows the data elements in the customer record that are most important to my business? If I can do that, and I can talk in that language across the organization, now I'm going to solve problems in a new and different way. I have to say, as a bit of an aside, my dad is an engineer, and I feel like at MIT I have to share this. So he was looking over my shoulder as I was previewing these slides last week, and he pointed out that we had actually dropped the mine in the wrong part. So I slid it over to it correctly. Originally, we had this drawn so that it was going underneath the rig. But anyway, just a little nod to all the engineers in the audience. He was like, the hammer is the thing pulling the oil up, guys. So don't let your consultants draw your engineering diagrams. Okay. All right. So premise hopefully is reasonably clear. Yeah. Okay. All right. So I think what's interesting, hopefully, about what Karan and I are going to share is we think most organizations think about data assets in the wrong way. And we would like to kind of challenge how you think about data assets. So the organizations I work with, and again, would love to hear from you all and challenge me on this, but the organizations I work with think about data assets as data sets or data universes. So for example, I'll take like a B2B type company that I might work with in financial services. So they tend to have data assets and describe them in this way to me. They say, hey, we have sources of firmographic data that we buy on the market, like a Dun & Bradstreet, for example. I get information on all the small and medium businesses here in the US. Maybe we buy data on buyer signals. There's companies like Lyft that will go around and say, hey, not only is this a business out there in the market, but they seem to be interested in the retirement products or something of that nature. Okay. And they'll say, hey, these are our data assets. On the internal side, they'll say, I have a lot of data about how I engage with my customers. It's sitting in my Salesforce, or it's sitting in my Adobe Marketing. It's sitting in one of those platforms, and it speaks to how the customer engages with the service center, or how the customer engages with our marketing and sales promotions. That's my data asset. Or for the customers who are giving me money, I have data in my SAP system. I have data in terms of my accounts payable, et cetera. I know how the entity is using my product, how they're paying for it, how timely those payments are, et cetera. And so often, when we start programs, projects, and we're looking to kind of create new data assets and solutions, we often are given things like this. We say, hey, here's my customer data set. Go at it, have some fun. And I think what we've observed through practice is that it's certainly not the most efficient way to go about understanding the value in the data and knowing what to use. It's also probably not the most effective way. You might think, hey, the best thing I can do is cast a very broad net and I'll find the most valuable things. I think from experience we would say that's not necessarily true. And so what we would like to suggest is the smarter way to go about it is not thinking about data assets as big data sets, but thinking of data assets really at the feature level. We talk about data elements. Thinking about individual features that are valuable to our business. Okay? So a simple example from the B2B world is industry code. So if I'm buying data from Dun & Bradstreet or other third parties, or I have data on my customers, I'm often using the industry code. And I would argue industry code, super simple thing. It is literally just a column in the data set, but it's an asset to our business to know that information and to know it well. And the reason it's an asset is because it is widely used across the business. So I would use it in prospecting, because most organizations are going to have different valuations they associate with different types of industries if you're selling in a B2B context. I would use it in if I'm an insurance company, in my underwriting, my pricing. The risk levels are very different for a construction business versus a white-collar consulting firm. I might use it in my product design. A lot of products are built to fit certain types of industries. And you can go on and on and on. And so our contention would be that's one example of a very valuable data asset. It meets our criteria of wide and important use across the business. Doesn't necessarily meet our criteria of uniqueness. As a company who's buying that data, obviously I'm not the only one privy to that information. Now maybe I'm doing something to clean it, to edit it, to use it, and so that might bring some added value. But that's just a very, very simple example of where we would like to kind of take this idea of valuation. I don't say anymore, hey, Dun & Bradstreet, that's one of my data assets. The data asset is the specific fields in there that are important to me. Okay. A little more of a slightly more sophisticated example. A lot of the organizations we work with, or the ones I work with, at least on the marketing and sales side, we wind up, either they've created or we will create something analogous to an engagement index. And what I mean by that is a composite metric where I'm looking at how the customer engages with our business. So I might draw from my SAP database, my payables and receivables and things like that. I might draw from my Salesforce, or Microsoft Dynamics universe to understand how the customer is engaging with my promotions, my salespeople, et cetera. And I might kind of bring that together to form an index about the customer. Okay? So it's no longer a single field, not something quite as simple as industry code, but it becomes a data element or a data model, you might argue, that winds up having use across the business. And so I would use it in my marketing to determine, which channels do I use to market to this entity? Do they engage with me digitally, or do they only engage via in person? I think we certainly use it in directing sales efforts. We use it in measuring performance, et cetera. So it will be widely applicable. And I think where this idea gets kind of cool and interesting is when you flag something like an engagement index as a valuable data element, it provides the opportunity to use that element in departments or divisions that may never be thinking about that. So very, very simple example, worked with an organization where we had this type of engagement index for their marketing and sales team, for their acquisition-oriented team. But the data existed for all their customers. Now, it just so happened that because they had flagged this as a super important kind of element, and they were actually just talking about it at kind of a leadership meeting, we hadn't done it in a systematic way, it turned out that the service team kind of latched onto this and said, hey, I wonder if this speaks to how we serve our customers when they call in with problems or whatnot. And it turned out to actually wind up being quite a useful data element for that service organization, even though the drivers were almost exclusively kind of front-end focused from marketing and sales. And so being able to surface it up in the organization as a valuable data element built more use cases across the business, which in turn just enhanced the value further. So kind of the asset value kind of grew upon itself, if you will. Okay. So I'll pause here, but I mean, this is at a simple level. Karan's going to give you the more sophisticated descriptions, but this is what we're interested in. Is instead of thinking of data assets as these big, cumbersome data sets, how do we think of them as fields or elements or features that might exist within my data set? Okay. If you haven't yet, we'd love for you to complete poll question 1, because we wanted to get a sense for, are people doing this or not? So again, we have, Karan and I know what we see from the organizations we work with, but we don't want to presume that that is representative. So I know a number of people have already filled it in. Our first question was basically, to what extent are you viewing and valuing your data assets at the feature level, kind of versus the left-hand side of the page at the database or data entity level? Karan, what's the pulse of the group?
For answers, we have not at all, most of the time, and then sometimes, and then always is only 10%. So there's definitely a lot of value in treating data as a feature catalog. So this would be one way for your data strategy team, your C-levels, data, CIOs, CDOs, all to talk together and say, these are the valuable data assets for our company. These are the things we need to talk about. Are we using these data assets in a data strategy? So that's the intention.
Okay. So if 10% of people are doing this at the feature level all the time, we would love to hear from you, because we'd love to learn from kind of best-in-class examples. As you said, otherwise, it sounds like most people aren't quite to this level. Okay? So that's helpful to hear. All right, so in terms of why is this important? So I'm sure some ideas come to mind immediately. I think as we step back and look at it, we saw 4 areas of benefit so to getting to this level of understanding of the value and valuation. First, certainly efficiency is in play here. So most organizations, their data science teams, others who use the data are not working together. And it's a somewhat intractable problem. So if we can surface the most valuable elements, we think it can be a more efficient process. We know it certainly is for us when we're engaging with companies, building data models, et cetera. So there's definitely an efficiency play in surfacing these elements. I think there's a value in focusing on just a subset of elements. So for example, if I know in that 1,000 feature data set that I'm buying, there are actually 3 things I care about, I can change my decision making. Well, for one, I might go back and ask, hey, can I pay a little bit less and just get these 3 features that I care about? So it might have value just right like that. It will have value in focusing my data preservation efforts. So I'm going to really worry about and invest effort in maintaining the quality of data in the features that matter to me. I don't need to worry about the quality of data across all 1,000 records. I need to worry about the ones that are really important to our business. Another one that I think is pretty high impact is what we're calling kind of the strategy element. What I think we've found often is when working with executives, especially executives outside of the sort of data office, their eyes sort of glaze over a little bit when we talk about data models and data use. And if we can talk at the feature level, these tend to be things that they understand. And it provides us a way to engage the business decision makers differently. If I can say, hey, we're driving a lot of this off of something as simple as industry code. First of all, they know what that means, and they can ask us some intelligent questions. And so I think it provides a way to communicate the value differently. And then, of course, from a sense of actually creating value, if I can focus my efforts on a few fields, a few features, et cetera, I can apply them across the business. I've expanded the value that those fields or features bring. And so that's, again, part of the value creation story. Okay. So I think for all these reasons, this is a good topic to get into. I won't belabor these points too much, but again, if I step back and put my finance hat on, if I believe that there is value at the data feature level, then what I want to do is, well, first, I want to make sure I understand it. I want to know where is the value? Where is it coming from? And I'll let Karan speak a little bit more to identifying that. Then I want to enhance it. So to the extent that I have some features, some models, et cetera, that are especially important to the business, I want to think about how do I make those as high quality as possible? How do I make it frictionless for my teams to use and access those specific data elements? Because if I want them to be used as broadly as possible across the business, they got to be easy. So how do I enhance the value in that way? And then last, I want to think about my, what we're calling data liability. So I want to focus my data definitions, my data controls on the very most valuable features. Again, if my idea is that I need to master all of the data that my business touches, that's an intractable problem. You just cannot really solve that problem. But you can solve that problem if you focus on the most valuable elements. If I'm worried about compliance or risk or regulatory implications, I had better first worry about them with the data elements that I'm using most and most importantly in my business. So we think there's some kind of risk control value there as well. Okay. So that's what I have by way of setup. Hopefully the what is clear, at least conceptually, and the why is clear. And I'll pass it over to Karan to give you a little more detail on the what and the how.
I believe there is a poll. So if you can,
oh, that's right.
Yeah, finish the second poll, and that I think we have some answers already. It's where do you see most potential value from your data assets? If you have finished the poll, thank you. So 4 options were revenue generation, cost reduction, risk mitigation, and innovation for data products. I believe revenue generation won, and then second one was innovation on data products. So again, the idea came, and again, we'll talk about use cases here. So what Jason covered was the why, right? Why do we need this? Why do I want my data strategy, business strategy all aligned, right? And then why do the C-levels care about this, right? What do we want to talk about at the board level? If it's an important dashboard, right? What is that one important dashboard at the board level we want to talk about? And that is this monetized data element dashboard. We'll talk about the what and the how in the next 10 minutes, right? So the what is an example here. The example here is from a trucking company. This is where they were able to take a data strategy, look at a business use case. They wanted to save money on maintenance. And with the business impact here, we'll start with the business impact. 30% reduction in the maintenance cost for the fleet management for customers. Net new revenue, they were able to create a data product where they're offering this product to customers so they can reduce their fleet management expenses. And then data product as a term and data product became a strategy for the company, right? They were able to do that with two things. Data strategy was, let's collect more data. Let's get data from external sites. Let's tag what data is important to us, right? Geolocation is important. Vehicle usage is important for that fleet. Warranty is important. What inventory do we have right now in our internal channels or external partners? And consolidate all of that with the IoT data. They were able to create a data product, which now they're selling out, and it's probably about 10% of their business today, right? Now, the monetized data elements, the things they were able to do, provide the value together through a dashboard, is looking at individual data elements like the VIN number of that car or that fleet, what you need, or the truck. They looked at vehicle fault codes, which means what we think is going to go wrong and what are the fault codes which happen by usage of this product. And then they were also able to use the vehicle service history. When was this last vehicle serviced, right? And those are the important data elements, and that's why we want to tag them as monetized data elements. In some cases, we'll also talk about monetizable, which means they are important, but they've not been used yet in your data strategy. What we're going to do is look at about 5 different case studies, and I've been in 7 industry verticals in the last 30 years, so we'll talk about some of these concepts being used in many industries. So the first one we're going to look at is a software industry. So recently what a software company did was they said, okay, there's a lot of demand of what we call as product information management, right? What is someone else selling on their e-commerce portal, right? What are their products? What is their pricing? And as of this date, what is their pricing? So someone, as a software company, created that PIM model, right, as a service. And now they're selling it as a product. And they were able to monetize it. In a manufacturing company, and I've been in a couple of manufacturing companies before. I grew up in a manufacturing company. This one goes back to the same thing of when will my machine break? I don't want any downtime in my company. So what do? Well, we look at elements like component age. So look at the component age for the machines, not at the machine level, but at the component level. Look at the machine runtime. When is the machine running? When is it idle? What parts are being used? Which features of the machines are not being used? So that becomes your MDE, monetized data element, and that's been used. And then the impact is you lower the manufacturing variance and you have higher productivity. If you look for examples in retail, and I'm sure there's a lot of examples in retail, retail has been using a lot of our monetized elements like cell number and email addresses to market us, right? But there are other things. One of the retail client was able to bring up the CTR improvements based on the customer age and linking that with credit score, right? So you just don't want customer age and, oh, I'm going to market you something new. Right? I'm not sure if anyone has heard of this brand called Young LA. So my teenager all of a sudden said, I want Young LA t-shirt. I'm like, I've never heard of that brand. How did you know about it? Well, because they were able to market, my 15-year-old, this new brand. So again, how they use it? Well, they use the credit score of the parents, right? Data you can buy. And then you can look at the family history and you can look at the customer entity, right? And they were able to monetize and get more business. So again, the monetized data element in this case was in retail was that customer age and credit score. Healthcare. So this is where we want to get into, how do we send notifications for patients before they become a patient, right? Hey, your health is going on. You really need to do this. And then the MDE here, the most important, call it the attribute or the data model. And MDE is not an element itself. It's not a database element. It could be an element. It could also be a complete data model, right? These are the things your leaders should know. These are the things your business should know. So in this case, the patient information, data model becomes your MDE model, right? And the impact is cost reduction for healthcare. And some of the healthcare providers, ZS works very closely with healthcare. We've been doing some of these things. And the last example is a banking example. This is where when you're trying to sign a new line of credit or provide a new loan, right? Again, you want to do risk mitigation. In this case, you don't want to give that loan. So you are making sure what are the things you're using, and actuaries are doing this for a long time, right? I've been in insurance about 6 years. This is where the actuaries are doing it. Actuaries do not look at all the data available to them in insurance space. They'll look at specific things. Those specific things are what we call as monetized data elements, or MDEs in future. That's what your business should be driven for, right? So in this case, the example is the external data, life events, right, and the customer entity. So now they're trying to, insurance companies and banking companies are bringing the data from both spaces, try to say what is important, and then tag that on a dashboard and say, these are the things we're looking at. Couple of examples, I know Jason alluded to many. For example, the data scientist being siloed. So in many companies, you'll have big data science teams. You have COEs. A data scientist might be using R in one group and Python in another group. They do not talk about their features. They will tell you the outcome. They'll say, yeah, we were able to, in our business unit, save this much money or bring this much money in our company, right? But they will not go at the feature level. They won't tell you what was the important things they used in their algorithms, right? So what MDE concept does is, this is where we're calling it data feature catalog, right? This is where that one dashboard you have within the company, where you can say, here's what is important in our company, here's what we have monetized already or used in our data strategy, and here are likable things or important things we think where we have value for the data, which we can use for future data strategy things or data monetization. With that, we'll now talk about the how, right? How do you identify what is important to you in your data, right? It's a very simple 6-step process, right? The first one, of course, is discovery, right? This is not where we say, well, go discover what else is, everything is in the data. There's a way to do it. This is not data enablement by, of course, you have to use a data catalog tool. You have to use data marketplace, right? But to discover what is important, you have to look at, what are the most queried elements? What is the most linked data in your company, right? And there are technical ways to do that. You start looking at the existing features like we talked about, right? You've got features in Department A, you've got features in Department B. How can we use that, right? And we got a really example of engagement model, what Jason provided. Then you also have your business KPIs, right? And those KPIs are always summarized up. So, but what drives those KPIs are your important data elements, right? And you tag them all in a dashboard. And of course, like we talked about, what is unique about your business, like what Jason said. What is someone else might be interested and pay you for that data, right? What are your persistent identifiers, things which go across the systems or applications in your company? So that is where you discover, and you're looking for potential value or things which are already valuable for you being used in the company, right? And the second step, of course, is consider, right? So now that you've got a list of monetizable data elements or a dashboard, now you look at, well, how are my data profiling processes working, right? You look at your conceptual data models. Do you have conceptual data models, in the company, and what makes those conceptual data models? What are the levels of those modeling hierarchy? And then, of course, are those being used in business strategy? Because in the end, we want the data to drive the business strategy, right? And let the business leaders know this is what is available in our data. Can you make a strategy on it, right? And align that strategy. Once that is done, again, the outcome we're trying to look for is what we call as the MDE inventory, right? Or whatever you name in your company, right? It's part of your marketplace, but this is like one important dashboard which summarizes your data marketplace to say, this is the most important part of the things in our marketplace, right? This kind of becomes your recommendation tool for data scientists, for data engineers, for data team members to look at. So this is where you do decide, right? Once you decide that these are your data sets which are important to you, that's when you make it available for your data engineering team, part of ELT or ETL, make it available for your metadata management team, and of course, for your application teams to say, have you used these things in applications? You can go beyond and upfront and say, okay, are these things being controlled from a quality perspective in the business processes? So this MDE becomes one important dashboard which is discussed at the engineering level, within data science, and even at the leadership level to say how it is linked to your strategy. And that's where this integration portion comes in, is where you integrate the MDE dashboard or data feature dashboard across your business processes, across your business decisions, across being data-driven, right? And in the end, of course, link those MDEs to say, well, was I able to monetize this, right, in future? And if I was able to monetize it, then, of course, you add more value to that data attribute, right? And that's how you quantify that. And at some point in future, I know there's some discussions tomorrow where we talk about data monetization and things like that. I know, Sunil, you want to talk about that in the session tomorrow. How do you really make that asset as and put some value on it from a financial perspective, right? This is your internal monetization, right? And of course, you can make more products for it. So that's what the how is. We talked about the why. Jason talked about the why. I talked about a little bit about the what and the how. And then, of course, we want to open up for questions. Yeah.
If you back up to that slide, I just one point to maybe add on the discovery process. So I think there's an inclination to want to put a dollar number on each data element or data feature and actually do that based on the actual value delivered to the business. So, okay, how much cost are we taking out of the system through this data model, or how much incremental revenue? And I guess I think what we've seen is I would caution against that because it's a slippery slope. And I think what we would argue for is to come back to that top level picture that I began with. You know a meaningful portion of your company's value is tied to its data. You can identify the value tied to your brand. Your marketing agencies will give you a good idea of that. You can identify the value tied to your packets, et cetera. The remainder is going to be the value tied to your data. So that is the actual value in total that exists. And I think as Karan is talking about, when we go through these processes to identify the most commonly used features, and then to identify the uniqueness of those features, and that can be done qualitatively. Our argument is that's all you need for the valuation. Because collectively the data must add up to that overall number, and if you can isolate the most commonly used features, you can ascribe a higher value to those. And so I think that is how we have typically approached it, is working a little bit more at that macro level. It requires a bit of trust from the business, but in fact that's how they would value any other asset anyway. They're not going to, unless it's a real hard asset, they're not going to evaluate it by some other means. So that's why I think that discovery mechanism and understanding the breadth of use and applicability is super important, to be able to say this data feature is used by 11 departments and 16 models touching XYZ functions. So we're ascribing a high level of value to it. We're going to assign that as our decile 10 value, if you will, from a data element standpoint. And again, I think that's how we would argue the valuation should begin.
And this is the more the data element or data objects are being talked about in your COEs, if you have those, that's where the value becomes higher. And then that's where they start getting more. That's where you start seeing more innovation, right? Have you used this particular data attribute or this data model in your business, right? Those are the kind of questions which allows for improvement of that data culture, right? And that's where you start monetizing things, and things will eventually come as data products. You can have internal data products and external data products. That's what we want to go for. We'll open up for questions. There's one last poll. Oh, please go ahead.
I was just going to ask a question.
Yeah.
How do you differentiate between the monetizable data elements and the process of critical data elements?
Great question, yeah. So critical data elements are what we have been talking about as financial and regulatory. And there's also this concept of sensitive data elements. That is something which is already in the business. People are doing it, especially banking and financial sector. And insurance is already tagging critical data elements. And that's very simple. If this data element is on a regulatory report, tag that as a critical data element. Some mature companies are saying if this data element is on a run the business report, tag that as a critical data element. right? And that is the job of data stewards, right? To identify some of those critical data elements. What we are saying is not critical. You could consider critical data elements as a subset of MDEs, but MDEs takes to the next level. What are the data elements and data objects? It could become a data model, right? Customer entity model, I would call it as an MDE, right? PIM, which is product information model, we would call it as an MDE. So there's a little difference. Critical data elements is just an attribute level or a database level. MDEs or data features, like we call it, right? And we also have Sharif data strategy from ZS. So the way we've at ZS told the word, features, data features, it's at a feature level. It's not an attribute level. It's a little bit different. But great question there. We'll do a poll 3 if you have not done that. That's the last of the poll, and of course, open for questions.
The wonderful thing is nobody has said no to poll 3 yet, so I think you guys are onto something. Dave, you got to.
Yeah, we do honestly want feedback. I think even though we're consultants, we don't presume we have it all figured out. So
yeah. The last question was, does this idea allow for accelerated progress in your organization? And the important word is accelerated. Of course, every organization is there for progress, right? But the question is accelerated. And right now the poll answer is yes for 68 out of the 80 answers. So yeah, I would say 85% is saying yes. But open for questions on the concept or anything on the slides.
Question, is data profiling a word in use, a term in use anymore? Or has that been deep-sixed or relabeled, ignored?
Can you say more? What do you mean by data profiling?
I'm asking you. I'm asking the question. You just answered my question.
Yeah.
So I was looking at my notes.
You got my answer, but I'll let Karan.
I was looking at my notes from 2006.
Yeah.
Okay.
And data profiling. So I had a 2 or 3 hour talk with a guy who claimed authorship. And my impression is a term that has fallen out of use.
I have very good friends who are dentists. They will say, well, is flossing out of fashion? Flossing your teeth out of fashion? And I'll say, no, it's not. It's a choice. Data profiling is important. It's a subset. You have to know what data you have. And then, of course, data profiling will allow you to say, where do you invest your money for data quality? So profiling is still something which is needed as part of enterprise data governance. It's maybe out of fashion for some companies. If they're already mature, they may have it automated. There are many technology companies not doing that data profiling as your data comes into the company, right? So I think companies have become more mature that the term data profiling is not being used anymore. But it is important. It is a good habit.
There's a question over there.
Hang on. The most popular question from the internet right now is, what does the data value stream map look like? I think everybody would love to see an example of what that map looks like. Repeat the question? Sure. Yeah. What does a data value? Sorry, what does a data value stream map look like? That's the question.
I do not have a slide on that here. We've written articles on data value mapping. The value proposition, again, from a monetized data elements perspective, is you would be able to say, for example, in the example of, again, in an example of manufacturing, I come from Rockwell Automation before joining ZS. We were able to do something called Rockwell on Rockwell, which means can we take data from our manufacturing plants across the world and bring into our ecosystem and leverage to see if we can bring operational excellence, right, and efficiencies in our plants, right? And in our session earlier today, we heard from PepsiCo where they said they were able to automate a complete plant because of data. So that was the answer, right? The value will come in once you identify what data is important to you and then start monetizing it for internal and for external.
Thank you. I have a comment and then a follow-up with a question. So the first comment was, I think I heard you say we need to separate kind of this notion of a unit of sale versus a unit of value. Like you may buy something from D&B, it's a brick of data, but what you're saying is you need to look at it from the unit of value perspective. I would take it one step further and say that those individual fields don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in a hierarchical nature that helps describe and understand relationships that exist in the data. If you just take a field like weight, weight of what? Right, so there's a hierarchy there that I think could help enforce or kind of reinforce your model that you were talking about. So the second is actually a question. The model that you kind of described in the last slide, this linear progression, seems very bottoms up to me. It almost reminded me like of this team building exercise where you find a bunch of raw ingredients and it's like go make something, right? Like make a Fazili man or a tower or something, right? Like. And I'm struck by, like, well, maybe you should start instead at the what problem are you trying to solve? How could you make money? How could you reduce risk? And then figure out if you have the data to do it or not, instead of just starting with a bunch of Lego blocks and trying to build up from scratch. I guess that was a question. What do you think about that?
Do you want to answer from a business perspective?
Yeah. So I don't fair. So first, on your comment about hierarchy, completely agree. Yeah, we were trying to come up with a simple example, but on board. Yeah, so I think what we're saying is don't start at the raw ingredient level. Start with the, see if I can continue the analogy. Start with the meals you've already made and find out which ingredients they have in common. I think that's what Karan's describing. So you already have 100 data models, floating around in your organization. What are the common elements of those? Those that's where we search first for the features or the data elements that are actually most valuable to the business. So yeah, you're right. I wouldn't want to be like, here's all of our data, go figure it out. That's the intent. Now you might still need to kind of do a little ingredient level work, if you will. But the accelerators are working at the model level.
I can give a little technical example. So in companies where they're doing three things, selling hardware, selling software, selling services, right? You can take any company where they have three different type of products, right? Totally different categories. Your data model for your product is going to be different. Well, what is the common important items in your product model which are common across all your business, right? I'm not saying create a canonical data model, create a similar structure and enforce it, but what are the most important things across your three PIM models? It could be three customer models, it could be three pricing models. What are those common important things? Make sure they're on your MDE list. Make sure your CDO knows about it. Make sure your CIO knows about it. Make sure everyone in your company knows about it, starting from data scientists to data engineering. That's what we're trying to do. But great question, thank you.
So
we use DNB as an example. That was just an example.
Yeah, no offense to DNB.
No offense to DNB. Like I said, we're not saying that the value they provide. What in general, when data scientists are using a big file, they're not using all the attributes of a file. That's what the intention is, right? So create those data feature logs, right? Have your data scientist go back into and add things to the inventory, right? To say what exactly are they using, right? So then you have the value. Right? So, but you're not saying that you don't need LexisNexis data or DNB or other external data from the partners. That is important data. Any other?
There's a question right there.
So the question here, yeah, I appreciate the talk today, thank you. And it's definitely an appealing model, certainly from a 30,000-foot view. As a practitioner, I think about a few nuances here that I'm just curious how you handle it in the weeds, if you will. The first is fundamentally, in particular, if you have a company that's already leveraging data, to your point, this is something you've already done. You're reasonably mature, maybe not all the way there, certainly, but you're maturing. It seems to me that you're going to continue to have evolutions and leverage new use cases for that same data, for these same MDEs, and part of what you have here is to accelerate that, I suspect. How often do you then reevaluate the value you attribute to each one of those MDEs? Is there a best practice there? I'll pause there for 1 second. I assume it's straightforward.
We actually had an extra slide we kind of thought not add it here because of the timing, but yes, there is a process of, it's very simple. I mean, when you do critical data elements or sensitive data elements, right, you basically assets and basically say, okay, is this data still important? Can I have a data sharing agreement? What do I add into my data sharing agreement? All of those things you revise and renew based on the business problem. So yes, there has to be a process to look at the MDE dashboard proposed or data feature dashboard to say, is it still valuable for us?
Yeah, and I would just say, I mean, from my experience, I mean, most of these decisions are about the data are on an annual basis. So I don't think this is something you need to be pulsing much more frequently than that.
Okay, that's helpful. And the second part is, if you think about, if we choose an example, for example, maybe you want to figure out the valuation of a home. No doubt some MD is going to be something about price per square foot. That seems like a reasonable thing, or square footage, and then you're going to calculate price off that of that. The challenge there is that in practice, depending on exactly what you're doing, there might be 3 or 4 or 5 different versions of price per square foot. One that includes finished, one that includes unfinished, one that includes garage, one that includes, accessory dwelling unit. Each of those are actually quite valuable for different business problems. Each of them are important. And if you have a catalog that only says something about price per square foot, how in the world do you then not end up with just a data explosion and a data dictionary problems that we've seen in MDM, traditional MDM, for a decade?
Yeah. Great question again. So one of the things we should have said here is we're assuming that, again, if you look at any data model, right, or any DMM, any maturity model, right, you can use the demo model or anything else. What we're expecting is you're at least mature to the level 2. Right? Because if you do not even have data governance in place and those kind of things of data stewards to say this term is more important than this term, here's my critical business term, or here is my business glossary. If you do not even have that, this would not work, right? So there's some level of maturity as an enterprise. We're assuming it's already there to build on it, right? Now the vision here is to have a data marketplace. I know there were some concepts of data marketplace. There are many vendors who are doing it. But the intention is to have an AI level of data marketplace. As a data scientist, I should be getting recommendations to say, Karan, you're a data scientist. Have you used this data object? Have you used this MDE or monetizable data element in your research? Right now, data scientists spend about 70% of the time looking for data. Right? We want to go to the next level to say, you're getting a recommendation. Have you even done anything about it? So again, we're hoping that there is a maturity already to build on MDE. This MDE then becomes future of an AI marketplace.
Yeah, and I'll just add, it's not fully automated. So you do need some business intelligence. So even though it might flag that price per square foot is a common element across all these models, at least everything we've done so far, someone has to look at it and say, wait a second, that's actually not the same thing. So we can't just say that that's one single field. So I mean, there is a little bit of art, I guess, to go with the science behind this.
You must be at least this tall to ride this ride, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So one question from the internet here. I think this is actually a good question for everybody. Does data have a place on my income statement, and should it?
If you want to take that question, and I know Sunil
I think on the balance sheet, I don't know. I mean, that's I think it's an asset. So that's where I would put it personally.
It's not for us to decide. Unfortunately, it's the accounting profession that gets to decide.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not an accountant, but you all weigh in on that one too. So
you may have addressed this, but I guess the question is the role of innovation in all of this, because to some extent, where a lot of the value comes from is thinking of a use for one or more piece of data that you hadn't considered before. And once again, saying a miracle will occur here is the kind of cartoon. First, am I right that plays a key role, and how do you address that non-trivial role?
Yes. Do you want to take that?
Well, I mean, I guess so. When we've seen this in action, I think by surfacing these elements and having the right groups in the room to talk through it, that tends to be where the magic happens, so to speak. Like, so a real simple example that kind of blew my mind was we were working with an organization that across different departments, they had data that basically what it told me was, this was for a financial advisor. So Karan is our financial advisor in this example. And one of the data elements was as simple as, does Karan answer his phone? Okay. And the sales team had that data element, and the service team had that data element, and a bunch of different people had that. And it turned out they were all using it, and we're like, why are we using this? And it turned out they were using it to figure out, should we call, or should we text him, or should we try to ping him digitally or whatever. And then they got people in the room, and they started thinking, well, how unique is that? Well, we know a little bit about that data element. Of course, we know, will he answer for us? But we wonder, does he answer for anyone else? And so I know a group of people who are now trying to make a consortium among asset managers to pool all that data and to find out if Karan really answers his phone ever. So that's an example of how the innovation happened, but it wouldn't have happened if you didn't have those different people sitting together saying, hey, why is this valuable to our business? Because it's not intuitively something you would say, wow, this is a super valuable data element.
In some cases, I've heard it often mentioned that it's good to have someone from outside the organization, because inside the organization, you think about how do we normally do things. And someone said, well, have you ever considered doing it this way instead, because the data would allow you to do something different? So sometimes there's a certain amount of stickiness in organizations that makes it difficult to be innovative.
A great argument for Karan and myself, so we'll take that.
I do want to add, there's a new book coming from Dr. Doug Laney. It's called Data Juice. It's already out. It's got about 100 stories on things like this. We talked about adding some of the concepts of MDEs in the book, so it refers to some of the MDE concept. But there are amazing stories. Go read, get a copy of Data Juice.
Really, I think, do we have any last question? I think we're coming up
Actually, so keep going. Let me get the microphone over. Turns out, interestingly, the date of September 12th, 2001 is the date that the insurance industry decided data would not appear on the balance sheet anywhere. So that decision was made for.
Fair enough.
Couple of questions or comments. One, I think from a practitioner perspective, people are doing this intuitively in organizations. They're just not by calling us MDEs or something like that because people know it. So this is a good framework for them to really think about that in that sense. But most of the use cases that you have mentioned are all data that has proven value or are causal in relationships. But when you think about big data and everything else, there are so many correlated data elements which work for a particular set of time but then lose value in those pieces of it. So what are your thoughts on monetizing data concepts, data elements in that regard as well? And the second question that I do have is, when we think about monetizing, oftentimes when we look at internally, the question that gets asked from a business value is, weren't this supposed to be done actually this way? So kind of like, there is a discounting factor when you monetize data internally versus if you are trying to face it as an external kind of a data element that you can sell or get more revenue. So what's your take on that?
So let me answer the first question. So there, in the MDE concept or MDE dashboard or data feature dashboard, there are two things. One is things you've already monetized in the company, which everyone should know about, because that's where you get the budget to keep it alive. Then the second part of MDE is monetizable data elements. This is where you have perceived value of the data. I can give a quick example. When we now go to a touristy space like Statue of Liberty, I went for a spring break there, and they were saying take family pictures. You take family pictures for free, and then they show it on a big screen, right? Now that picture is actually now being used in AI algorithms for feature recognition, right? So sometimes we're giving our data away, which in this case a picture, which is being used for the data ecosystem, right? Having an AI model being trained on our data, right? So someone is of course investing to train AI models for all the visitors on Statue of Liberty or Empire State or things like that. So that is the monetizable for an image perspective. I believe your second question was more again about how do we perceive that accelerated value? That is the discussion which happens, again, it's a company culture. Is the company data driven? If the company is data driven, they will allow you for data innovation. That's what we want the companies to be. So that's a very company focused discussion or cultural focused discussion.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think you raised a really good point though, that it's not static. So value can go up in the data, value can go down. And so that argues for tracking it periodically. And it may very well be that a data element, goes out of use over time. Valuable to know that so that you can make decisions about that element. Maybe you need to stop buying it, things of that nature. I will say there is a little bit, I think to your point also, a lot of organizations are doing this. There is a little bit of marketing and branding here. I think pulling this into something that looks like value will work within your organizations in a way that's better. And I think you're right that the easiest perceived value is if I literally take a data element and sell it. But I think we want most of the value creation is internal though. So we don't want to lose sight of that. I think that is part of the message here as well.
Well, unfortunately, that's the end of our time. But I want you guys to thank Jason and Karan for great presentation on this.
Great questions.
Just so that you gentlemen know, there were a couple of questions on the internet that were paragraphs long.
Okay.
We wouldn't have even.
But can we look at them and answer? Yeah.
I'll be able to answer those.
I'm sure you guys will be around for the rest of the event. Thank you guys again.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Righty.